Why does Joseph Smith's character matter so much to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And how does one's perception of his character shape the way you would address the historical record? My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American religious history and a specialist in Mormon studies. I've authored several books on the topic. This is my second video this week in a series on the new Gospel Topics question and answer pages that have been produced by the LDS Church. On Monday, I did a video on the Q&A page on polygamy. Today, I'm doing the one on Joseph Smith's character. And then on Friday, I'm going to do one on the Book of Mormon translation, the other page's topic. But I think it's important to open up today's video on the Q&A page on character by asking the broader question of why does this topic matter, Joseph Smith's character, especially when it's so subjective? The idea of character is much more abstract than the topic of most of these other Q&A pages like the translation of the Book of Mormon or polygamy. So I think this topic might be a bit more wide-ranging, but I hope in the end just as helpful. Let's dig in. As I warned you, we need to start this topic a bit broader, talking about character in general. Most importantly, I want to emphasize that this notion of character is a modern invention. Especially in the religious setting and when placed on religious figures. For instance, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, those prophetic figures do not match modern conceptions of character values and being good or likable people. Instead, the Enlightenment and the Age of Revolutions, the birth of what scholars call modernity, also brought the invention of this idea of character or the related term charisma, an idea that these leaders have a certain sense of authority based on their moral aptitude, their skills, their general approach to the wider world. A really important book that just recently came out is Molly Worthen's book, Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump, which shows how this very definition of leadership, or the character traits we expect in our leaders, has evolved over the past few centuries. From Benjamin Franklin during the American Revolutionary era, where he tries to chart out how he could improve his character and therefore make him a better leader, all the way to now we expect modern leaders to reflect our cultural values. But that has not always been the case. And you can trace this even in the case of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith fit into antebellum American conceptions of religious charisma. But in many cases, those principles, those elements, those traits evolved in the ensuing centuries, the ensuing generations, to where now much of what Joseph Smith did or believed in, or importantly, why people believed in Joseph Smith, do not squarely fit modern day conceptions. So in trying to shape a Joseph Smith that's usable for the present moment, we often get a disjuncture, a hard fit, which means we have to read certain elements of Joseph Smith's history one way to fit our modern day conception and ignore others. In other words, this quest to understand Joseph Smith and fit him into contemporary standards of morals and character is a theological endeavor, not a historical one. It means emphasizing some elements of Joseph Smith's past, inventing others, and ignoring others still. I mean, the most prominent example of this is a story that had long been told in LDS circles of when Joseph Smith was having a leg surgery as a young boy, that he denied drinking alcohol or the chance to drink alcohol because he knew that it was wrong. This is a story that gets repeated out of Lucy Mack Smith's history. That story is meant to tell the character of Joseph Smith, that even though he hadn't received the revelation on the word of wisdom, he knew drinking alcohol was bad. That, of course, is a selective historical reading, that there's not a lot of historical evidence for Joseph Smith denying alcohol at the leg surgery based on the grounds of knowing it's wrong. It probably has more to do with the fact that his father was an alcoholic. And further, Joseph Smith continues drinking alcohol long after that. But that story, that anecdote, is just one example of the types of stories Latter-day Saints will tell in order to place Joseph Smith in a type of character study that is usable to the present. All right, with all of that said, all that throat clearing, let's dig into this new Gospel Topics Q&A page and what it can tell us about where the current LDS Church sits in relation to understanding the history. By the way, my quick pitch that if you enjoy this type of analysis, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. As I mentioned before, this is my second video this week on these new Gospel Topics Q&A pages. On Monday, I did one on polygamy, and on this coming Friday, I will do one on the Book of Mormon translation. And every week, I try to do these deep dives on historical topics, often but not always on Mormon history. So don't miss out. Subscribe if you haven't yet. All right, let's get back to the history. The introductory section for this Q&A page is quite revealing. They lay out the stakes of how we are going to be understanding Joseph Smith's character in relation to his prophetic calling, his revelations, and indeed modern discourse surrounding his place in history. It starts with the prophecy that Moroni tells him on the night of September 21st, 1823, when Moroni visits him and tells him that his name shall be had for good and evil among all nations. And it also mentions that Joseph Smith is praying because he had felt a bit sinful. But note this phrase that it ties in, that though Joseph was not guilty of committing any great sins, he still felt a bit sinful. Note that very first intervention at the very start of this Q&A page is going to shape Joseph Smith did not commit any great sins because he could not commit great sins because he is called of God. That is a theological framing that is going to shape this entire discussion of how Joseph Smith's character was cultivated and how it relates to his prophetic legacy. Further, that framing that your name shall be had among good, among the believers, those who hearken to God's call, and evil among the wicked, is going to therefore structure how you view particular sources. Some that are trustworthy, those who call Joseph Smith good, and those who are not, those who call him evil. This is what scholars sometimes call a self-referential prophecy. That means it is telling people how to interpret things in the future in a way that reinforce that initial message. Now, it goes on, this introductory section, to provide categories for the type of mistakes one might find in Joseph Smith's life, because he is human after all. They could be slander based on false information. They could come from an incomplete grasp of historical sources or a misunderstanding of the culture, or they could be that Joseph Smith was just human. Now, you could take those categories and place the different accusations in them, but note the theological assumptions behind them. If they are serious, it's often slander based on false information. If they are a bit nuanced or complicated, it just means you don't understand historical sources or misunderstanding the culture. And if they are real mistakes, they are just human mistakes. They just mean Joseph Smith are fallible. This is an interpretive schema that is provided for someone to be able to understand Joseph Smith's fallibility that does not question his prophethood. In other words, everything needs to fit within this context of a called, though still sometimes human, prophet. And mistakes are those of a striving nature, not an intent nature, and they are not meant to undercut Joseph Smith's other prophetic positions. Now, if I come across in this video a bit more perturbed or frustrated with this page as I am when discussing others, that's because I am. This page, even though it's supposed to be framed as a historical approach, is far from it. I think this Q&A page has a lot more problems than the typical Q&A pages, and let me explain why. The modus operandi, the primary impulse behind this page of understanding Joseph's character, is a base assumption, an interpretive schema that you can separate Joseph Smith, the fallible individual who made some mistakes, and Joseph Smith, the prophet, whose revelations are untouched by this fallibility. It talks about how Joseph Smith publishes the revolutions that rebuke him, and it quotes Joseph Smith himself at one of his final public lectures or sermons, saying, "I never told you that I was perfect, but there is no error in the revelations that I have taught." Note that schema that's going to shape all of this. That yes, Joseph Smith is fallible, he's human, but the revelations can be untouched. I'm going to get into some more overall thematic issues with this, but I want to give two examples of how Joseph Smith, the fallible human, cannot be fully divorced from the Joseph Smith revelations. Now, I understand why that schema has to be there, because it wants to preserve this prophetic power that can remain unsoiled by the fallible Joseph Smith. But I don't think you can fully do that. Let me give you two examples from Nauvoo. One is in May of 1842 at a city council meeting when John C. Bennett, who is being kicked out of the city due to his actions and the connections to proto-polygamy going on, maybe a story for another video, drink for the drinking game. Here is Joseph Smith speaking to the city council, knowing that his push to become the new mayor may receive some pushback, including by one city councilman by the name of Hiram Kimball, who was not a Latter-day Saint, and whose wife, Sarah Kimball, had actually rebuffed a Joseph Smith petition to add her as a plural wife. So in other words, there is some tension between Joseph and Hiram. And when Hiram Kimball raises some objections, Joseph Smith scribbles a revelation that says, "Verily thus saith the Lord, Hiram Kimball has been insinuating evil and fomenting evil opinions against you with others." And he gave that revelation to the council, saying that Hiram Kimball, even though not a Latter-day Saint, seemed to recognize his place. He knew how to read the room. And the other members of the council knew not to listen to his evil speaking. Again, this schema, this organizational matrix of understanding what sources can be trustworthy and what can't. That shows Joseph Smith speaking with his revelatory voice within an individual context that I think can raise questions of the prophetic infallibility of that type of revelation. One other example. The next year, Joseph Smith's assistant, William Clayton, is introduced to polygamy. And one of the first things he does is he marries the sister of his wife. So William Clayton is married to a woman named Ruth Moon. He then marries Ruth's sister, Margaret, as a plural wife. But he does not want to stop there. He actually wants to marry a third wife from the Moon family, a younger sister named Lydia. The problem is, he went to Joseph to ask about this, and Joseph then told him no, in one part because Joseph Smith himself wanted to marry Lydia as a plural wife. I'm going to talk about character and plural marriage and devote a section later on in this video. And then to emphasize this to William Clayton, he actually tells him that he received a revelation saying you can only marry two women from the same family, which explains why Clayton can't have the third Moon daughter, and that Joseph should. Again, that shows this concept of revelation cannot be fully divorced from Joseph Smith's own interests and activities. I don't think you can separate Joseph Smith the revelator from Joseph Smith the human as easily as this page seems to indicate. After providing these general thoughts, what I call an organizational schema for how to understand historical episodes and events and documents in regard to Joseph Smith's own character, the Q&A page moves into particular themes. First, with the legal world, and was Joseph Smith ever convicted of illegal activities? It brings up that Joseph Smith was involved in 21 civil cases, although the Joseph Smith Papers Project talks about the hundreds that Joseph Smith was involved in, whether as a defendant, a prosecutor, a judge, and so it's actually lots and lots and lots. But it frames these court cases by saying that most of them resulted from prejudice against the Latter-day Saints or false allegations against Joseph Smith, and that there is only one unambiguous conviction in Joseph Smith's life, and it gives the example of late in Nauvoo when Joseph Smith assaults someone. Yes and no. There's only one unambiguous conviction, but that phrasing is complicated. It doesn't say there's only one time that Joseph Smith was guilty, because there were other elements that are ambiguous, that aren't very clear. I'll talk about one at the beginning of his life. I'll talk about one at the end of his life. At the beginning of his life, in 1826, Joseph Smith is tried for practicing magic, for using a seer stone to hoodwink people into money. The term that the judge uses in the court docket is Joseph Smith the glass looker. I may do a video on this topic in the future, but in general, Joseph Smith has these charges brought against him for taking Josiah Stoll out in this magic-making endeavor. Now, we don't have the result of this trial for a number of complicated reasons. But what is clear, and what most scholars agree on, is that Joseph Smith likely could have been found guilty on it. And if he wasn't found guilty, there is a chance he was found guilty. You don't have the record of how the case ended. So there is a case he was found guilty. If he wasn't found guilty, the primary reason why he wouldn't have been found guilty is the judge found leniency, generosity in Joseph Smith, and he stayed the case, decided not to convict in return of Joseph Smith's promise to do better. Again, maybe I'll do a video in the future to talk about this complicated case, but this is probably the case that this page has in mind when it says unambiguous conviction, because there is a lot of ambiguity. Let me talk about the later point in his life. Joseph Smith died under a legal suit, right? He was in Carthage for trial for treason. I'll get to that case later on in this video. But let me emphasize that chances are, if Joseph Smith survived the attempt on his life in June of 1844 and was brought to trial, he likely would have been convicted guilty again of treason. So I think that's very, let's call it generous framing to emphasize that all of these court cases, or a majority of these court cases, were hopped up. Whereas Joseph Smith did a lot of things in his life that flirted with, if not trespassed, the law. And there were specific cases where he was likely guilty. And so this unambiguous, the only one unambiguous conviction is a bit misleading. Then the Q&A page moves to the issue of money and the question of, did Joseph Smith pay his debts? The obvious instigation behind this page, or the historical topic, is the Kirtland Safety Society, which it directly addresses. And it says that the reason why the Kirtland Safety Society, a financial scheme that Joseph Smith was one of the primary instigators of, that collapsed and whose legal repercussions overshadowed Joseph Smith the rest of his life. It frames that episode by saying an international financial crisis in 1837 contributed to the collapse. Which is fair. It's totally true. There was a major banking crisis in America in 1836 to 37, and the Kirtland Safety Society was definitely caught up in it. You know what also contributed to the collapse? Joseph Smith and the others' mismanagement of that banking fiasco. In fact, they were denied the opportunity to build the bank by the state legislature because the financial crisis was already setting in, and they still pushed forward. Two things can be true at the same time. One, the financial conditions of America in 1837 meant that every financial scheme was going to fail. Two, the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking experiment was especially designed to fail. There were people at the time telling them this is not a good idea, and they still pushed forward with it with major repercussions. And yes, Joseph Smith lost a lot of money over it. He lost more money out of the Kirtland Safety Society fiasco more than anyone else. But his actions were still a major cause for it. And further, he continued pushing the Safety Society fiasco long after it was readily apparent that it was going to fail, bringing more people into the crisis. You know who really was upset over it? Parley Pratt, an apostle who would later forgive Joseph Smith, but he got excommunicated for critiquing Joseph Smith for how he handled that fiasco, knowing the problems in the moment. Just because these activities, which Joseph Smith had to deal with for the rest of his life. In 1842, he filed for bankruptcy, and those and that legal proceedings existed through his death. So that's another court case that he likely would have found guilty of. It just would have been a matter of a plea. Just because those actions weren't entirely nefarious does not mean that they weren't reckless. They certainly were, and that's one element of Joseph Smith's character that is often softened in order to fit this prophetic narrative. Another theme that this page focuses on, and justifiably so, is, did Joseph Smith exercise undue political power in Nauvoo? Now, this is a topic close to my heart. I wrote a book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier. So I ate, slept, and drank Joseph Smith and Nauvoo power every day for several years as I wrote that book. And I don't feel very satisfied with the reckoning that's found on this page. And what's especially frustrating is the Joseph Papers Project provides far more than enough evidence, and including analysis and commentary in the papers that go far, that exceed the kind of simplicity that we find on this Q&A page. Again, I apologize for getting a bit more negative on this video than I have in others, but I just find this page so problematic. So for instance, it frames Joseph Smith a accrual of power, the many positions he held as mayor, as chief judge, as postmaster, that many of the church's critics, the page says, found this dangerous and un-American. Let me emphasize, it wasn't just Joseph Smith's critics outside the church. There were people inside the church that saw it as dangerous and un-American. If you were a neutral observer, you would have found it dangerous and un-American. Here again, we see this theological framework for understanding, interpreting the evidence in ways that I don't believe are really justified by the historical sources. Within Nauvoo, it talks about how some critics, again, framing it as critics. And by the way, I have a whole video on Joseph Smith and politics that's coming out next week that I recorded before these Q&A pages came out. But I'm going to be starting a series on Mormonism and politics, starting with Joseph Smith's political vision and critique of American democracy. So hang tight for that next Monday. Anyways, next topic it goes to in Nauvoo is talking about habeas corpus. Again, framing that only critics accuse that Joseph Smith of finding ways to be beyond the law, of avoiding capture, especially when it came to extradition back to Missouri. I may talk about in the future, in a video about how Joseph Smith's use of habeas corpus to avoid his recapture and taking back to Missouri was a clear violation of legal establishment in America, and that it would take an extremely naive and optimistic interpretation of the history to justify what Joseph Smith did in terms of habeas corpus and the laws that were passed by the Nauvoo City Council, which were in flagrant violation of state and federal statutes. The page justifies this by saying that Joseph Smith and the Saints viewed these actions as necessary. That's quite a defense. If that's a defense lawyer presenting that, you're like, gay plus, you are making the case for why you should avoid a serious repercussion. But that still doesn't avoid the fact that it was illegal, that it was illogical, and that it actually brought more problems than it solved. Again, that theological schema of justifying these activities because a prophet does it or because it's necessary does not lessen the recklessness. Speaking of which, it goes on to talk about the Council of 50. Joseph Smith establishes the Council of 50 in the last few months of his life. The records of the Council of 50, which were released in 2016 after decades of being sequestered, was why I wrote my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, by the way. And it tries to, but the Q&A page tries to downplay the radicalness, or at least the implementation of the Council of 50. It acknowledges that the Council of 50 presented a new idea of world government, but it claims that it was a future government and that Joseph Smith and the Mormons did not organize such a government. It was mainly, they were still working within the existing legal frameworks. That is a very generous interpretation, I would say. Instead, they saw this as a here and now thing. The Council of 50 had immediate repercussions. They tried to rewrite the Constitution. They're acting as a sovereign body. Now, part of this is they existed in an apocalyptic mindset where they believed this government was going to be a bridge from this world into the millennial kingdom, but that does not downplay the fact that the Council of 50 had a radical proposal that says something about Joseph's character beyond this benign interpretation that is typically found within the church. And that's even before we get to the Nauvoo Expositor. Now, the story of the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor is well known. Many of you probably know it, that it's published the first day of June, 1844, by dissenters within Nauvoo, denouncing Joseph Smith's secret practice of polygamy, his accrual of political power, and his clandestine activities, and his political networking, and his land speculation, all these things. Joseph Smith declares the Nauvoo Expositor a nuisance. They destroy the press, and that eventually leads to Joseph Smith being arrested and taken to Carthage jail, where he was killed by the neighbors. A few things that are noteworthy on this Q&A page, trying to explain this whole ordeal in ways that salvage Joseph Smith's character. One, it trots out the same defense that I mentioned before, that they did this because they believed they were acting legally. This is a very clever playing. It is not saying that what they did was legal, nor is it confessing that what they did was extra legal. There is some cultural and political and legal interpretations of antebellum America that might have justified the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor. Dallin H. Oakes, while still a law professor, wrote one such article, but I will say most art historians are a bit squeamish with the certainty that people give for justifying, yes, it was legal, but they justify it here by saying that the Joseph Smith and others believed that they were acting legally. But I think this overstates the debates that led to the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor and what it tells us, indeed, about Joseph Smith's character. The Nauvoo City Council deliberations that resulted in denouncing the Nauvoo Expositor as a nuisance were heated and they were pressing. And a majority of those council members, who were Latter-day Saints, devout followers of Joseph Smith, did not buy Joseph Smith's argument that the Nauvoo Expositor was a nuisance and must be destroyed. It took 4 meetings across 2 days for Joseph Smith to urge them with the importance and significance of destroying the Nauvoo Expositor, because there were several in the council who were saying, what you're doing is illegal and it's bad, and this is not something that we should pursue. But Joseph Smith at one point, as well as Hiram Smith, laid down their fists and says, no, you must destroy the Nauvoo Expositor, invoking his secular and religious authority over them to do it. That says something about Joseph's character that is often glossed over, and again is kind of too tidied up in this Q&A page about Joseph Smith being a bit reckless. That does not match the modern conception of prophet. By the way, this does not touch what happens after the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor with increasing tensions. Joseph Smith, yes, is originally arrested for the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, but those charges are eventually dropped, and instead he is charged with treason, because he ordered martial law in the city of Nauvoo in order to confront the internal and external threats going on. It is pretty clear that Joseph Smith's ordering of martial law was illegal. That's why he was charged with treason. This is the court case I mentioned that was hanging over his head when he was killed by a mob at Carthage jail. He most likely would have been found guilty because it was pretty clear. He does not have the authority to declare martial law. He did declare martial law. He would have been guilty of treason. Let's get back to general principles or an overall organizing schema for understanding these issues that I touched with before I touch on one final particular. Throughout this page is a theological view that someone having weaknesses up to a certain point does not disqualify them of being called of God, which is what the page specifically says, that these weaknesses do not disqualify Joseph Smith for being called of God. It even quotes Lorenzo Snow for saying, I was grateful in seeing Joseph Smith having these flaws because I knew if God could call on someone with so many problems, I too could work out God's will because I myself am fallible. The problem is, Joseph Smith is always fallible in theory, but never fallible in practice in the LDS tradition. In other words, Latter-day Saints will stumble over each other to emphasize the idea of fallible human beings, that everything is mediated through human beings in the Mormon practice. But they always shy back when giving examples of Joseph's fallibility. In other words, there's a common quip that Mormon theology implies prophetic fallibility, but no one believes it, just like Catholic theology implies Pope infallibility, but no one believes it. In other words, Mormons have the theology to allow for mistaken leaders, but they don't believe it. And you see that in this case, in this very page that admits that Joseph Smith was a fallible human, but then trying to reject all the particular episodes where that humanness might have played out. And this then plays into the way that they interpret sources. And how do you get reliable information on Joseph Smith? One of these questions. It explicitly says, do not rely on Joseph's critics. That's the theological schema at place, because you can only understand the mistakes, if there are mistakes, in the concept of a faithful congregant within the community of believers. It quotes Gordon B. Hinckley, the LDS prophet from 1995 to 2007, saying that these critics are so anxious to pluck out examples from the panorama of the history and create a caricature. One might say that that same thing happens when you're working from the schema of belief, that you are only going to pick out episodes in order to create a caricature of a prophet. That's a theological argument. That's not a historical argument. It then structures how you approach these evidence and these sources. This is why this theological framework concerning Joseph Smith's character that has to fit the modern day impulses of morality is always going to curtail the view of how Joseph Smith is viewed. This is why I think there is still immense distance between all the great scholarship that is, say, found on the Joseph Smith Papers Project websites that don't fully translate to these theological understandings that you might find on the Gospel Topics Q&A pages. Which brings me to one final example, a concrete evidence of Joseph Smith's character. And I apologize for this video going on so long, and I apologize again for being so heated about it. This Q&A page was released the same week as their new page on polygamy. And yet, in discussing Joseph Smith's character, the topic of polygamy doesn't really come up because Joseph Smith's reckless practice of polygamy, and I do truly believe it's reckless. I think that's the most faithful in the terms of having fidelity to the sources. That's the best interpretation of the source of how Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. But Joseph Smith's reckless practice of polygamy is the greatest challenge to the orthodox interpretation of Joseph Smith's character. This includes how Joseph Smith handled Emma's involvement, as well as his at times megalomaniac quest to be sealed to more and more women, including in the late summer months of 1842, when Joseph Smith is on the run from the law. His life is dangled over him while while Missouri is trying to extradite him back for trial and certain death. He still, during those months, takes on several more plural wives. You can't understand that action without understanding the recklessness behind that polygamy. This is why, to save this character of Joseph Smith image, is why Joseph Smith and others are presented as a reluctant polygamist in narratives, which is a vision that does not capture how Joseph Smith actually practiced it. And this is why I believe so many within the Latter-day Saint tradition are now having difficulty when confronted with the historical evidence of Joseph's polygamy that do not square with their idea of Joseph Smith's character and his position of prophet. This is why we have a growing number of polygamy deniers within the Latter-day Saint community, because they are prioritizing these very principles found on this Q&A page of Joseph Smith's character. They are prioritizing that character over the historical evidence of Joseph Smith practicing polygamy. They start with the assumption that Joseph Smith can't lie. And because Joseph Smith denied polygamy, therefore he didn't practice polygamy. That's why this polygamy denial movement is in many ways a product of the church's own teaching, an anxiety that's still found because you see it on this page on Joseph Smith's character with the Gospel Topics Q&A. Let me close by saying that there is still a lot of historical disagreement among qualified scholars over Joseph Smith's character. This is not a settled consensus. You have some people on the side of Richard Bushman, who wrote Rough Stone Rolling, who argue that the closer you get to Joseph Smith, the closer you engage the documents to know the story, the stronger the character appears. I don't agree with that. But also, I don't know as much about Joseph Smith as Richard Bushman does. That's a difference of opinion. You have, far on the other side of the spectrum, a scholar like Dan Vogel, who wrote now 2 volumes of his biography on Joseph Smith, who presents Joseph Smith as a pious fraud. You have someone between those like John Turner, a non-Latter-day Saint historian whose new biography of Joseph Smith came out from Yale University Press just a couple months ago, who denounces both the real faithful reading of Richard Bushman, but also denounces the term fraud of Dan Vogel. So there is a broad disagreement over what Joseph Smith's character might be. And that's before you even get to bring in these theological schemas that are found within the Gospel Topics Q&A page on defining Joseph Smith's character. In other words, it is hard enough to interpret Joseph Smith's life's motives, priorities, principles, and indeed character, before you start placing a theological matrix of understanding some sources and accounts as faithful and others as critic. This is why I think this quest to preserve Joseph Smith's character is always going to come aground because it is too shallow to understand the depth of the historical record and the complexities of Joseph Smith. I hope this video made sense. Again, I know I've apologized before, but let me apologize again for the length of this video, and especially for some of the fire in my sermon, so to speak, today. But I really find this Q&A page problematic, especially compared to the advances I see with other Q&A pages, because it is still dominated. It's playing the theological cart before the historical source. This is why history matters, because it keeps us grounded in the sources to understand these important questions that have direct ramifications for us today. If you like the video, please make sure to hit that like button and share with others, and subscribe if you haven't yet. These discussions are only becoming more important, which is why I'm grateful to have these discussions on this page.